All right, so today's lesson is on Michelangelo Buonarroti. Michelangelo, like Leonardo da Vinci, sorry, check your bags out. Yeah, like Da Vinci, Michelangelo was a true Renaissance man. Michelangelo was a man that was skilled at very many different crafts. That's what a Renaissance man is. You know, we talked about that the other day with Da Vinci. He's skilled at sculpting, he's skilled at painting, he's skilled at architecture, he's skilled at a lot of different things, just like Da Vinci was. This picture of him is a self-portrait, a picture that he painted of himself. Basically, I mean, you've seen the New Yorker cartoon, you lean over and see yourself in the mirror and you paint it. He looks probably in his 50s or 60s when he painted it. He was a very skilled craftsman in a lot of different arts. Michelangelo was born in about the same place that Da Vinci was. He was born in a little suburb outside of Florence, where Da Vinci was born in Vinci. Michelangelo was born in Caprice. It's right outside of Florence on March 6, 1475. So you think of it, it's kind of like Mount Washington is to Louisville, just a little suburb right outside of Florence. He is thought to be one of the greatest artists who's ever lived. He was a sculptor, a painter, an architect. He participated in a lot of different arts. And he didn't do as much with sciences and things like Da Vinci did, but he was more into sculpting and painting. We'll see in a minute why he kind of thought of himself as more of a sculptor than anything else. He lived to be 89 years old. He died in 1564 on February 18th, so just a little less than a month before what would have been his 90th birthday. And he was living in Rome at the time. 89 is pretty old for this time period. 89 is kind of old even for us in this time period today, in the modern era. But 89 was pretty old for a guy in the Renaissance. They usually lived into the 50s, 60s, not much older than 70 if they even made it that far. So he's a pretty old man. All right, his early years, Mozart was born. After he was born, his mother became very ill. So ill that she couldn't take care of him. And his father was always kind of torn between taking care of him and taking care of his mother because his mother was so sick. So Michelangelo lived a lot of his early life kind of with a neighbor. There was a stonemason that lived up the street that was a friend of the family. And so Michelangelo spent a lot of time over there. He lived there until he was about 10. His mother actually died when he was 6, but he still kind of stayed over with the stonemason's family for a few more years. Because his mom died so early, he kind of lacked childhood affection, didn't get much attention like a child would from his normal parents. He sort of lived a foster life. So he retained kind of a bad disposition because of it, and because his mom died so early too. From living with the stonemason's family, he grew to love sculpture and working with stone. He always had stone around him. There was always stonemason's tools around him, chisels, picks, axes, things like that. So he kind of grew up, nature versus nurture. He sort of got a stonemason's upbringing. And so we'll see in a minute too, he sees himself more of a sculptor than of anything else, even though some of his most famous work are paintings, which we'll talk about the Sistine Chapel too. See our little cartoon. Don't forget to bring Michelangelo some stone to play with.
Yes, dear.
Yes, dear. This time period was really good for somebody to be an artist too, because as we talked about, the Renaissance means rebirth. They're kind of rebirthing ideas from the classical Greeks and Romans. And so there's a push towards being more human and a push towards the arts and things. So there's a lot of people for him to study with too, because there's a lot of people that are picking up arts, stonemasonry, sculpting, painting, different arts, music is starting to make a push this time too. Remember what we said about it being a rebirth? What's it a rebirth from? Somebody raise your hand. From the church? Because in the medieval times, the church was in control. And if you didn't do what the church told you to do, then you were excommunicated. Pretty much relegated you outside of modern society in that time. So this is a push back towards those Greek and Roman ideas. To be a little more human. Alright, the Renaissance period is from the 14th to the 17th century, just a little bit of a review. That's the 1300s to about the 1600s, so it's about a 300-year span of time. And it's a bridge between the Middle Ages, where there were a lot of people who were illiterate. The only people that were really allowed to read were the priests and some of the nobility could read, but even a lot of the nobility couldn't read because they just had priests to read to them. The nobility were the only ones that really had any money that was worthwhile. There were a lot of wars in the Middle Ages. The Crusades, the Christian church is on a lot of crusades against Muslim and Jewish territories. So there's a lot of wars in this time period. Disease, barbaric invasions. So it's a bridge between that and the modern era, where the emphasis is placed more on education, more on advancing life here on earth instead of life in heaven, and a strong centralized government. In the Middle Ages, you had the feudal system, so you had a lot of lords that owned land, and then they had serfs or peasants that lived on their land, and in repayment for letting them live on their land, the serfs did work for them, tended to their flocks, made sure their animals were taken care of, took care of their yards and things and their crops. So now, in this time period, we have a strong centralized government. One leader that is in charge of everything, and most of the decisions come from him. Everybody can hold different jobs. They can be themselves. They don't have to be answering to a king all the time. And there's also a strong appreciation of the arts that comes out. So music makes a push, visual arts makes a push, sculpting makes a push, dance and theater starts to make a push and start to come out of the woodwork because there's a push for this kind of stuff. Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael were also influential painters. And to round out the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Donatello was another influential sculptor and architect of this time period. All of them very well skilled in different things, so they were all good Renaissance men. Michelangelo's beginnings in art. This is one of the first things that he did, Battle of the Centaurs. He was only 16 years old when he did that. So he was around the same age as some of you all or some of your friends. Maybe a couple of years younger than you. 16 years old when he sculpted this.
How big?
I'm not sure. Good question. It probably is kind of small. Something he probably worked on himself. Probably tablet size, I imagine. His father, his biological father, recognized his intelligence and his talent, his ability to draw and paint and sculpt. At about the age of 14, he sent him to study under other professionals, painters and sculptors. It was about the time that he left home, he left his foster family and his father to go around to Venice and Florence and Rome and study with other people in the field. His work eventually catches the attention of the wealthy and powerful art patron Lorenzo de' Medici. Now the de' Medici family, so Lorenzo from Medici, which is another small town in Italy. The Medici family is an extremely powerful family in this time period. They're rulers, kings, art patrons, they have a lot of money, and for him to get commissioned by the Medici family is a great honor because of the starving artist syndrome. A lot of people couldn't, because there's so many people trying to come out to the arts in this time period, so there's not very many jobs though, because it's not fully recognized yet. So for someone at the age of 14 or 16 to be recognized by the most powerful family around and be brought into his court is big news for him. So he goes to Florence to live in the de' Medici house, and he gets paid to create his art. Now the Medicis again have a lot of money, so he's probably getting paid a pretty sum to work for them, instead of just commission after commission for little people that are trying to keep you alive anyway.
Also, since he being accepted at 14, your professionals would want to be, and they don't be accepted in terms of that community. He's probably getting paid maybe more than other people that would normally come in.
Yeah, because he's so young.
He was young and obviously very talented.
He's a prodigy of sorts, so they probably pay him a little bit more because of that, because he's so young. They know they can keep him around for a little longer, because instead of hiring somebody who's 35 and maybe 10 or 15 years from being dead, they can hire somebody who's really young. Alright, Michelangelo is a sculptor. Michelangelo considered himself a sculptor first. First he was a sculptor and then he was a painter. First he was a sculptor and then he was a painter, at least in his mind. He enjoyed sculpting and he attributes it to he being happiest of his sculpting works. He attributes it himself to growing up in a stonemason's house and just being exposed to that in general. So nurture over nature. His exposure to that helped him become more of a sculptor. So between 1492 and 1505, Michelangelo completes two of his most famous works, the Pietà in 1498 to 1499. Write that date down, please. And David, which is in this picture here, from 1501 to 1504. David, now there's a lot of sculptures of David because it's from the Bible story David and Goliath, where David uses a slingshot and kills Goliath, the giant. But his becomes the most famous. Yeah.
Brianna had a question. She said, what's the
Oh, that the man
It's
standing
like a
on?
hymn. Nah, it's like when you're talking about what's behind. She would agree with that. His foot.
Oh, behind his foot,
That's like-
another chisel and a hammer.
There's your answer.
Yeah. So you see, he's got a chisel and a hammer. These are tools of the trade. So he's got a chisel and a hammer, and so to sculpt, you take stone and you just knock pieces off of it until you get a shape.
I don't know how you be scared.
Whether it was her or you or whoever it was.
What's he holding, David?
David is holding, we'll see a video that'll explain this in a second. David is holding a slingshot. Now, in the Bible story of David and Goliath, David is a little farmer that comes up. And in this time period, folks were like 4 feet tall. They were not very tall. They weren't as tall as we are today. But Goliath was like 6'5". So he wasn't a giant compared to what we know, but to them, he was huge. 7 to 8. So he was even a little taller than that. So he was pretty tall. He's like basketball player tall today, but he's also kind of a big burly guy because he's a warrior. The Babylonians are warriors.
Who was Michael in? He was like 7 foot tall?
No, Michelangelo. David and Goliath. Keep up with me. David and Goliath. Goliath was like 7 or 8 feet tall. So David, this little like 4'5" guy, comes up to this 8-foot dude, and he takes his slingshot. Now it's not a slingshot like you think of with the U and the handle and you pull it back like that.
Sack with the stone?
Yeah, it's a sack. So this is the sack over his arm, and he's got the stone in the other hand. And you load it by putting the stone in the sack, and then you spin it around and you fling it. And so when he flung it, that's the only thing he had to do. He flung it, and it went up and it hit Goliath in the side of the head, hit him in the temple and killed him. One shot, one kill.
To be a little more simple about that, it's basically like a small pouch, and it has 2 strings on the side, and then you'll have a little grippy place, and it's made to screw.
Yeah, and you swing it around and fling it. So it's a little different from a slingshot from what you all are thinking of,
But
but
it is the oldest type of slingshot.
yes, that's an original slingshot. Originally what that was.
It's like a sling.
Yep. Good film. Alright, so the first of his major famous sculptures is the Pietà. The Pietà was created for St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City. Now here's a little geography lesson for you. Vatican City is actually its own principality. It's not part of Rome or Italy or anywhere else. It's its own little place. It's got its own flag. It's got its own government. It has one resident. There's one person that lives in Vatican City. Do you know who that is?
St. Peter?
The Pope. No, not St. Peter. The Pope. The Pope lives in Vatican City. That's where his house is. That's where he gives his big speeches. That's where they pick new popes. All that's in Vatican City. So, it's still there today. It's still affixed in St. Peter's Basilica. It's the only work that Michelangelo ever signed. And he signed his full name. Michelangelos Bonaratus Florent Facivat.
Who he then later regretted.
Yes, he then later regretted signing it because he felt like he defaced it. All right, we're gonna watch a little video on La Pietà. And when he sang Michelangelo in Italian, because I used to be Michelangelo. So before we watch the video, there are 2 different. The Pietà is Mary holding the lifeless body of Jesus after they take it off the cross. So there's 2 different.
Who made the rest of the baby?
There are a lot of people made it. There's a different sculpture that has Mary and Jesus in it. There's 2. One is the Madonna. That's the Virgin Mary holding the baby Jesus right after he was born. And then there's the Pietà, which is Mary, who Jesus had brothers, so no longer Virgin Mary, just Mary, holding the lifeless body of Jesus after he's been crucified. So pulled off the cross. All right, I want you to watch this video and give you a little bit of filler about Pietà. Alright, shh.
Mary looks very young and beautiful, but her body is in her lap sort of enlarged to carry the body of her dead son, but the realism of that dead body, of its weight. One of the most beautiful passages, I think, of the sculpture is the way that she holds up his right arm and pulls up that flesh a little bit. And you really feel, first of all, that the marble is transformed by Michelangelo into flesh, but also the weight of that body, and through that weight, the loss of life that's so palpable for Mary.
It's the complete lack of resistance that his body offers and the exertion that she has to extend in order to hold it. And that contrast makes for the viewer, I think, in a very physical experience looking at the sculpture.
His body looks so much like the body of a real young man, the rib cage and the abdominal muscles.
And yet it's also idealized in the way in which there's this beautiful turn of his body across her lap. And for Mary,
So with the turn that he's talking about, do you see how it makes him look dead? And you see right here, you see what looks like a nick in the sculpting? That's the nails that were driven through his hands. And then somebody asked, why does his shoulder look like there's like 3 of them there? It's because he's dead, so his body is just lifeless. And the way that she's holding him, the way her arm is kind of underneath his shoulder, is kind of pushing the skin up. So it's a technique, it's part of the technique to make it really look like he's dead. Like his body's turned, his head's kind of just hanging.
She look bigger than you. If you look at it, she look like.
She kind of does.
So was he a full grown?
But she's probably got a lot of clothes on.
Mr.
Where's,
Watts, is this a full grown man? Like,
Yeah,
is it,
he's 33 years old.
I mean,
Where's
but
the,
she must be fat.
The signature, he signed it, and they probably say this, the signature is on this sash across Mary's chest. And the reason that, here's a little fun factoid for you. The reason that he signed it is because he was admiring it after he finished, and he heard someone else say something about it and then attribute it to a different sculptor. So they said somebody else sculpted it. So that made him mad. He got hot about it, and he came back in that night and he carved his name in it. And then he regretted it later because clearly you can't cover that up. And now you basically defaced it.
How
And,
do you deface it if it's his almost?
right.
well, because
Because he put it
he
right
didn't
there.
want it to, because it's the only thing that he really ever signed. He didn't want it to have, well, and he probably could have signed it lower on it, but since he signed it right there, it's kind of goofy to sign it right across her chest, right where everybody's gonna be looking. But that's why, so he got hot about somebody else attributing it to a different sculptor and came in and signed
as
it.
well, there's this interesting contradiction in her sweetness and the beauty, but also the strength and the scale that's necessary for her to easily hold him. Look how deeply carved that marble is.
The drapery.
This real love of the turn of the stone, the creating this sort of very vivid sense of alternation, really, of light and shadow, of complexity of surface against the broad, pure surfaces of Christ's legs, of his torso, of his arm.
Mary tilts her head forward and looks down at him. His head is thrown back, so there's a connection between those two necks for me.
And his neck is exposed to us, incredibly vulnerable. Christ's foot hangs in midair. Mary, her left hand is open and pointing delicately forward, as if she's still trying to comprehend his death.
But I think there's also a way of presenting Christ's body to the viewer, saying, this is the path to salvation. This is God's sacrifice for mankind, my sacrifice of my sons, that makes possible your redemption.
There is a kind of rhythm that points to that hand. The drape and the knee point up towards Christ's knees, which in turn create a kind of rhythmic bridge to her hand and to that sense of wondering. This is very clearly an image that's meant to be contemplated, and the pain and the suffering that Christ has endured,
And Mary's enduring.
that Mary is enduring, is meant to be contemplated as a pathway.
They're polishing the floor.
Okay, let's move on.
Right, so that noise, they're in these museums when they do these videos, so that's why that you heard they're polishing the floor behind it. That's what all that means. They're conning at it. So you see where the facial expression for him, clearly it makes him appear dead, because he is. And then her facial expression as she kind of looks down, and she's sort of in awe, like, why did they kill him? Or she's kind of mad about it, torn up about it. So he explains those pretty well with that, just with looking at it. Yeah, that's right. I hope so. He's supposed to be dead. All right.
example with the hang in it?
Yeah, that's the actual
It's not
example.
widely-
Yeah, you can't really see it, because it's all the same
I
color,
kinda see it,
but it's across the sash.
I saw like the G.
Yeah. Alright, so Michelangelo's probably one of his top most famous works. This and the Sistine Chapel are probably up on the top of his most famous works. This is his sculpture of David. Now, it's the Bible story, David and Goliath. It's his most famous sculpture, and it resides in the Accademia Museum in Florence, Italy. The museum was a school. The academy, it was an academy for sculptors and artists. And that's where it stays today. It's been outside, it's been inside, it's been a couple different places. But that's where it still is today. It's carved out of a single slab of stone. So he took one slab of stone and carved David out of it, out of this marble. It's marble. And it is 14¼ feet tall. It's from the biblical story of David and Goliath. It's meant to symbolize the heroic courage of the people of Florence, because David was from an area that was around Florence at this time. Goliath is from Babylon, and that they were warring tribes at that point in history. And when Babylon tried to invade, they had to stop him. And this is, for beating Goliath, David is made king of basically the whole world, this area. So it's about 14 feet tall. It's a little over twice as tall as an average sized male. Figure about 6 feet. The pizza?
What is that made of?
Marble. Yeah. All right. Anybody need more time on that? Megan? Telephone or phone? Yes. All right. So Michelangelo. Okay. Michelangelo and his paintings. Now, Michelangelo saw himself as more of a sculptor than a painter, but he's also famous for a lot of paintings. Oh, we didn't write the video. Sorry. Backing up. We're going to back up to David a little bit. I don't want to move on just yet. I got a video for him too. This will explain to you a little bit more about David. Here we go. Same thing, they're in the museum this time.
We've walked into the Accademia in Florence, which is an old art school, and is now #1 tourist destination in Florence, I think. There's a lot of people there.
And there's a long line of people waiting outside to get in, and it's hard to blame them because inside is Michelangelo's David, and it's unspeakably beautiful.
So this is a sculpture that's often seen as a perfect exemplar of high Renaissance art. And I suppose it's important to get the story out of the way first. So
Sure.
It's an Old Testament story, and it speaks to a young man whose name is David, who's brave enough to take on this terrible giant, this terrible enemy Goliath, that all of the older men are too fearful of to confront. And he does so without any armor.
He goes to battle against Goliath on behalf of the Israelites and defeats Goliath with the help of God.
Specifically with a slingshot and a single rock, but clearly with the help of God.
And you can see the slingshot in his left hand and the rock in his right. And although the Bible says that David fought Goliath without armor, it doesn't say completely nude.
If you look at the body, of course, it's in a kind of classical contrapposto, right? The weight is clearly on the right leg. The left leg is free, but the body is engaged in something even more complex.
You remember contrapposto from the Greek and Roman?
Yeah, when we sit on those.
Yep, weight's on one leg, there's some movement in it.
And more specific, much of the body is still relaxed. His right hand is just beginning to tense, and you can see his eyes have darted to his left. His body, it seems to me, is about to swivel and follow the head's movement. And so you have this sense that David has just caught sight of his enemy, and his body is just beginning to tense. He's just preparing to meet Goliath.
It's impossible not to notice the remarkable knowledge that Michelangelo brings of the human body and how it works, and the muscles and the skeletal structure. And he created this ideally beautiful figure.
Michelangelo had dissected the human body, understood its internal structure, and this is a fascinating thought. It was not long before this age that in the West we had no idea how the human body functioned. When we take for granted now in the 21st century that we understand the mechanics of the body, and so that kind of analysis of the structure of the body is really an extraordinary achievement. This is a sculpture that is about potential. It is showing this idealized body, but in a sense, we can begin to see ourselves in this kind of heroic stance as well.
This is nearly 3 times the size of a human being. You can see why Michelangelo later got the name Il Divino, the divine one.
It's important to remember that Michelangelo is a relatively unknown sculptor at this point. He's really young. He had one major commission, which is the Pietà, and then he comes out with this tour de force, which will bring him an enormous amount of attention.
It was commissioned by the city government of Florence in 1501.
It was originally going to be placed on one of the tribunes high atop the roof line of the Duomo in Florence, that is, of the main cathedral of Florence.
So it was meant to be seen from very far below. When Michelangelo showed what he had completed 3 years later to his patrons, the city government of Florence, they were astounded at how unbelievably beautiful it was and thought, there's no way you want to put this high up. We're going to put it in the piazza, in the square, in front of the Signoria, in front of the government building of Florence.
And that's because...
So Michelangelo actually sculpted David to, what are you doing right there? Don't touch things back there. Michelangelo sculpted David to put on top of a building so that everybody around could see it. But the people of Florence now, after he's died, they want it out in the courtyard. It's not out in the courtyard anymore. It's actually inside the building. But they took it down. They didn't want it up so that you couldn't see it closely. They wanted it down so that you could walk up to it and see it closely.
But did they still keep the one on top of the building?
No, this is the one. They took it down. So there's not one on top of the building.
Why are these two here? He made both of them?
Not only is the sculpture so extraordinarily beautiful, but because the story of David had come to be aligned with the story of Florence. It was a symbol of the Republic of Florence in opposition to the notion of tyranny. This was a very particular moment in Florentine history. The Medici had by that time actually assumed a great amount of power and had really subverted the Republican ideals of the city. And so this was a brief moment of the flourishing again of these democratic ideals. There were ways in which the poets referred specifically back to classical images of Hercules, and Hercules was a long-standing symbol of Florence as well. So there's a whole set of symbols that surround this figure.
By making a colossal male nude, and by that we mean way over life size, Michelangelo is taking on a type of sculpture that the ancient Greeks and Romans had made, and in a way surpassing what the ancient Greeks and Romans had done, showing that Florence itself has surpassed ancient Greece and Rome too. We know that Florence saw itself as sometimes the new Athens or the new Rome.
And in fact, an important part of the mythology of Florence was that it had been founded by the ancient Romans, and it was an inherent part of their identity. So this all makes sense.
It makes total sense that the government of Florence, the Signoria, would see this sculpture and bring it to the Palazzo Vecchio, bring it to the seat of government.
As its potent symbol.
A special conveyance was built to bring it to the Signoria. There were 14 greased logs that rolled it with the power of 40 men.
Over several days.
From the studio to the Palazzo.
And they didn't want it to open the cathedral. They didn't want it to close. They celebrated it. The city fell in love with this sculpture.
And saw it as the most powerful symbol they could imagine of their renewed republic.
Alright, so a lot of questions about why is he naked. Now in there they explain, in the story of David and Goliath, he fought Goliath without armor. Goliath had all his armor on and everything. And everybody else really did too, but David fought him without armor. Now, does that necessarily mean that he was naked?
He was wearing like a robe.
He was probably wearing a robe or something. That doesn't. He just didn't have his plates of armor on. So, but Michelangelo wanted to show that, and so that's why he was naked. Plus, sculpture in these time periods, and especially coming back from the ancient Greek and classical Roman and things, the sculptures were generally naked because it showed athleticism. And if you showed athleticism, then it showed that he was very powerful. He was powerful. So athleticism and power and beauty and these kind of things went together. Now, be mature, please. They did not find, he's not naked, and somebody asked, I mean, of course, an immature question about size of something. That's not, they found that gross. So it was just there to show that he was a guy. It wasn't there to be pornographic or anything, or to excite women or anything like that. Be mature,
So
please.
that really wasn't that.
They just found that portion of the body gross. So he made it smaller, because I got asked this, just because, well, alright. So, that's David, and that's Michelangelo's life of sculpture. And you see they had that building too. They built that building to house that in. It was supposed to be up on the top, but he ended up moving it down to the bottom. The people ended up moving it down to the bottom because they wanted to be able to see it a little closer. Michelangelo wanted everybody to see the power that was the city of Florence. Because Florence always called itself, like they said in the video, a new Athens or a new Rome. It wanted to be the next big powerful city. And so Michelangelo was trying to show that power with David up on top of the building. But the art now, you want to see it closer. So they moved it down into the piazza, the plaza outside, and now it's actually inside the building so that you can't touch it because fingers, oil on fingers ruins things. Thanks for watching it again. Alright, so Michelangelo's other huge accomplishment was his paintings, especially of the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo primarily used the fresco style, which is where you put a fresh layer of plaster on the wall, and then you paint while it's still wet. So the paint settles into the plaster, and the painting actually becomes part of the wall, which is why the Last Supper by Da Vinci, which was painted on dry plaster, flakes and peels apart, because have you seen plaster after it's dried? Is it very smooth? No, it's not very smooth. It's not very even. And so painting on dry plaster flakes, and when it flakes, moisture gets underneath of it, it molds, and that's kind of what's wrong with the Last Supper. The fresco idea paints it while it's wet, so the paint, the color actually becomes part of the wall. And so that's what that explains there. It's perfected in Italy during the 14th century and is a means of use by Renaissance artists. Now, the most famous fresco painting, these small paintings that tell little stories, is the Sistine Chapel. Pope Julius II, you should know this, Pope Julius II was the one that commissioned to sculpt a tomb, but the project was switched to painting a chapel ceiling instead.
How long does it take to paint that?
How long? It took him, here it is, 1508 to 1512. It took him 4 years to paint it. And contrary to popular belief, he did not lay on his back and paint. He actually stood and kind of kept his neck up like this. And he would write in his journal how it made him mad that the paint and the plaster and stuff would drip down on him. He was always a mess, and he was always just covered in dirt and grime and stuff.
Also, clearly, one person cannot do the entire thing by himself.
Oh no, he had a lot of help.
He did have quite a bit of help.
Yeah, and he actually died before it was finished too, so somebody else finished, other people finished it for him. Because he had help with it, of course, because you can't just do that on your own. That would have taken him 50 years to do if he'd done it on his own.
You did most.
So,
No, we didn't.
uh-huh.
You did drawings by himself, right?
He did die.
Yeah, he died at 37. Oh. I guess he didn't die. Maybe I mixed that up. My fault. Good catch. My bad.
Probably an art guy
Oregon
before he
school.
finished that.
Where is he?
That's what it was. Yeah,
That
okay.
one.
I got my people mixed up. Leonardo died before he finished something. Okay, my bad. Michelangelo did not die. He was only 37 when it was finished. He died at 89, so clearly he was still alive.
You finished that?
He did finish it then. His version of the old, so it's his version of Old Testament stories. 9 large rectangular patterns. The ceiling contains approximately 400 life-size figures over a space of about 5,600 square feet. Now your average house or apartment, your average apartment is 800 to 1,000 square feet. So imagine like 6 of those, almost. And that's how much area he had to paint. He painted, he did not paint on his back. He stood up 59 feet off the floor on a scaffolding. So it took him about 4 years, and he said, after 4 tortured years, I felt as old as weary as Jeremiah. I was only 37, yet friends did not recognize the old man I had become. He's very stressed about it. He probably got paid free for it. Pope Julian, because the Pope commissioned it, so the Pope was paying him. That was probably a lot of money. This is a picture of it. It's Bible stories, so it's several panels of different Bible stories. One of the most famous ones is here in the middle. It's the creation of Adam, the creation of man. It's right here, right in the middle. And that's depicting God and Adam reaching together and their fingers touching. That's actually this one right here. This is probably the most famous section of that ceiling. It depicts God the Father creating Adam, the first man, and was amongst the last panels to be completed, which told the story of the book of Genesis. It's the one right in the middle of it. Fine.
Wait, which one's that? Adam's the one with the
Yes. And you see the focal point in this? I've showed you this picture before. You see the focal point is the fingers, and it's because what? Can you see what draws your attention there? There's nothing in the background. As opposed to where Adam is laying on a hillside, and there's some color in the background, and God is kind of up in heaven with angels and things. But there's nothing behind the fingers, so that brings your attention into the fingers. So focal point can have something behind it, or it can be nothing. All right, that is the end of that. That's Michelangelo and his most famous works. I want you to turn your notes in. On the bottom of them, tell me something about one of the works that we studied today. Find one of his works, one that you like the most, David, La Pietà, the creation of Adam, or the Sistine Chapel in general. Tell me something that you like, something that you learned about it from today. Turn it into the top tray over by the door. Thank you for being so well behaved today.